Okay, this is chapter 5 of The Night Singer. 5. On hearing that the body had been found in the middle of the Great Alvar, the large limestone plain to the south of the island, Hannah slouched in her chair in an attempt to make herself look smaller. It wasn't the easiest thing to do when you were over 6 feet tall. She knew she might be the only member of the group who lived in Oland, and she wanted to stay at the station on the mainland. To find her feet before she was forced to head out into the community, Ove had promised not to say anything, but there had been a brief moment while he was introducing her where she was convinced he was about to mention Lars. His eyes moved over her and settled on Eric. Surfer. That was the first word that had popped into her mind when she saw him. It was only the middle of May, but he was already tanned and looked offensively fit. Dressed casually in a pair of pale jeans and a black t-shirt, his dirty blonde hair curly. He also happened to radiate the kind of professional friendliness that made her skin crawl. Eric, could you head over there and take Hannah with you? She's from the island after all. Take Hannah with you, as though she were something you could shove into your bag and carry away, or more accurately, return. Eric nodded and got to his feet. What about our meeting? Hannah heard herself ask. She and Ove had agreed to reconvene in his office after the morning meeting. She hadn't been given her security pass or her work phone yet. No service weapon either. We can do it later. The anxiety she felt refused to subside. Hannah hadn't been prepared for just how hard it would be to see Ove again. She wanted to be assessed on her own merits and was sick to death of allowing herself to be put down by what had happened. The others' eyes were all over her, and the woman called Karina seemed openly hostile. She knew who Hannah's father was, of course. Given how long she had worked for the police, she might even have been involved in the original investigation. Daniel was younger, and though all she could see in his eyes was curiosity, Hannah also found him difficult to look at. With his short, dark hair, he vaguely resembled Fabian, the colleague she had been in a relationship with before she left Stockholm. Amir nodded encouragingly, a little like the receptionist had earlier, and Hannah nodded back. She got up and followed Eric down to the garage. He didn't try to talk to her. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began typing away at the screen as she walked, probably trying to find more information about the call they were answering. Without a work phone of her own, Hannah couldn't do the same herself. When they reached the armory, Eric stopped to sign out of his Sig Sauer. He gave Hannah a questioning glance, and she shook her head. She had never needed to use her service weapon before, but it still felt strange to head out without one. You never knew what might happen. Want to drive? Eric asked once they reached the car. No. Do you know where Mockelmosen is? He continued, fastening his seatbelt. Hannah had vague memories of a class trip there in high school. Rocks, sit pads, and insects. The packed lunch she claimed to have forgotten because it was too embarrassing to bring sandwiches without anything in them. Her best friend Rebecca had shared her pancakes with Hannah. It was early autumn, and they had gone there to study the cranes resting on their migration south. There were clusters of the long-legged, long-necked birds dotted all over the barren ground, their cries like a dirge of trumpets. Yeah, but you should probably use the GPS. Not that the roads were in the habit of moving on Oland, but Hannah didn't trust her memory. Why was there a dead body in Mockelmausen of all places? Perhaps a tourist or mainlander had a nasty fall by the lake, hit their head on one of the many rocks there. That felt more likely than a drowning, considering how shallow the water was. During the summer, large sections of the lake dried up completely. How were she and Eric even supposed to get all the way there? It wasn't like they could drive off-road. The body was found next to a rest area, Eric said, as though he had read her mind. There went her first theory, though the rest area was also pretty rocky too. So you're from Oland? Eric asked. That explains the lack of Stockholm accent. I was in Stockholm for the last 16 years. What brings you back here then? Hannah shrugged. This wasn't something she wanted to talk to him about. What did you work on in Stockholm? Investigations, she replied. Aha, said Eric. His amused tone bothered her, but she was even more annoyed at herself for not being able to do better than this. She smoothed things over by saying something about how he knew what the job was like. There wasn't such a big difference between the city and the countryside. Eric began talking about the years he had spent working in Malmö. As they drove up onto the bridge, Hannah turned to look out at the water. There had been a time when she'd had nightmares about crossing the bridge, about it shrinking and swaying the farther out she drove, closer and closer to the inevitable climax, where her car plunged towards the dark, swirling waters. She always woke before she hit the surface. But something has happened as she drove over the bridge to bury her father and empty her childhood home, and she has now found she enjoyed it, at least while she was awake. The only home she had ever had was over there on the other side, and in her world, the bridge had always been there. By the time she was born in 1984, the 6-kilometer link between Oland and Kalmar was already 12 years old. The GPS told them to head south on the 136. Hannah knew that Rundbacksvägen would be there, but she didn't say a word. "It's so beautiful out there," Eric said as he turned south at Resmo and the limestone plain opened up in front of them. "You've never been to the Alvar before?" Hannah asked. "Nope, this is the first time the job's brought me over here. I've only been in Kalmar for 3 years, and I've only really been to the north of the island with the family." Hannah assumed he had gone to the beach up there like all the other tourists. The flat, barren landscape in front of them was beautiful, even with the thin haze hovering over it. But rather than keep quiet and enjoy the view, Eric began telling Hannah about his dream of owning a cottage in the countryside, of growing his own food and becoming self-sufficient. He was probably more of a tree hugger than a surfer, she realized, unless he was one of those preppers planning for the end of the world. He finally fell quiet as they pulled up at the rest area. Forensics were already on the scene, as was the patrol car that had set up the cordon. She assumed that it, too, must have come from Kalmar. Oland had a local police station, but up in Borgholm, but that was at least twice as far away. Eric climbed out of the car and spoke to the officers, introducing Hannah as his new colleague. Fortunately, he made do with her first name. "Who found the body?" he asked. "A couple of Germans," one of the officers replied, nodding over to a parked car. "I told them to stay until they'd spoken to a detective." Hannah felt her phone buzz in her pocket. Until she was given a work phone, she would have to use her own, and she was fairly sure this wasn't a personal message. Sure enough, it was Ove. He wanted her to meet him at the bakery in Farstaden in an hour. He had to come over to Oland anyway, he wrote, on other business. Hannah sent off a quick reply to say that was fine. "Could we be looking at a natural cause of death?" she asked. Now that she was actually working, Hannah felt fine. She knew she was good at her job. Her boss in Stockholm had even offered her a serious pay raise when she announced that she was thinking about leaving. There hadn't been any suitable positions open in Kalmar, but when she saw that Ove Holtmark was still working there, she got in touch, and he had found a job for her. Claimed they needed another detective anyway. It was only later, once she said yes, that she realized it meant he would be her new boss. "No, it definitely wasn't natural," the officer replied. "Take a look for yourselves. You'll see what I mean." Eric walked over to one of the technicians and repeated the same greetings as earlier. Forensics hadn't put up their tent yet. It wasn't raining, and the stone walls were blocking the crime scene from view. The police wouldn't be allowed into the rest area while the investigation was underway. Hannah glanced out at the flat landscape and shuddered. There was something unsettling about the way the mist seemed to be dancing just above the ground. The first she saw of the victim was an arm, draped over the collapsed stone wall. Judging by the size of it, it didn't belong to an adult. Hannah took a slow step forward, steeling herself for what was to come. The victim was a young boy, possibly 13 or 14, though it was hard to tell. He was wearing a baggy, hooded sweater and was leaning back against the rocks. His head, covered by the hood, was close to a sign giving information about the area in German. It was clear he had been beaten up. One of his eyebrows was split, the eye beneath it swollen. The other was half open. There was a large bloodstain on his sweater and a pool of blood on the ground a meter or so from where he was slumped. There was no doubt about it. This was a murder. Hannah scanned the ground for the murder weapon, but couldn't see anything. Her eyes came to rest on his right hand, which looked like it was clutching something. "What's he got in his hand?" she asked one of the technicians. The technician took a photo of the boy's hand and then struggled to unfurl his fingers. Inside was a small pink flower that had started to wilt. The last day. Swearing to himself, Joel pops his thumb into his mouth and sucks the blood. How the hell is it possible for a person to be so clumsy that they cut themselves on a cheese slicer? Molly stops pushing her cereal hoops around her bowl and looks up in surprise. They used to keep an empty jam jar on the cookbook shelf in the kitchen, and anyone who swore had to put a scrap of paper with their symbol on it inside. The jar vanished once Mom realized she was the only one. She was the one who swore most. Almost all the pieces of paper had her blue mark on them. Joel smiles at Molly. It sometimes feels like she is the only person who really sees him. Mom is hunched over a copy of Barmotern, like usual, reading an article about an exhibition at the art gallery in Kalmar. The other local paper, Olin's Bablet, only comes 3 times a week, so they subscribe to both. Petrie's thoughts are everywhere, probably on one of the many problems that have cropped up during the renovation. He spent the whole of dinner last night moaning about it. Joel takes a long bite of his bread and cheese and fishes his phone from the pocket of his jeans. Banning phones at the dinner table is one of the few rules Mom actually enforces, but he has been struggling to breathe since he woke up this morning, and he feels like he is about to start bawling. He needs to speak to Nadine. Blood spurting across the breakfast table here, he writes. She replies immediately. Who got sick of who? Joel looks up at his family. He briefly considers inventing an argument between Mom and Petrie, but it's just too unlikely. Besides, he doesn't want to jinx it, doesn't want to be responsible for making something bad happen. The cheese slicer flipped out on my thumb, he writes. Nadine replies with a laughing, crying emoji. Put that away, Petrie tells him. Joel sighs and does as he's told. His stepfather can really get on his nerves sometimes, but Joel doesn't have the energy to argue with him today. I want a pony, Molly chirps, probably to break the tension she can feel building. She's incredibly perceptive for a 6-year-old, or, as she would put it herself, an almost 7-year-old, even though her birthday is still 5 months away. I'd like one too, Rebecca tells her, closing the paper, but we can't afford it. But what if we can later? Absolutely. It's a risk-free promise because it's never going to happen. Petrie gets up and mumbles something about having to head off. His only contribution to clearing the table is to put his crumb-strewn plate and empty coffee cup on the counter. Joel often wonders what his mother sees in him. It's hard to imagine a more narrow-minded person. Petrie often throws out opinions about the government that sound worryingly like conspiracy theories. Who knows, maybe he's one of those crazy flat earthers. Mom sighs and turns the page, and Joel feels a sudden rush of warmth for her. For everything contained in that sigh. She has been through so much, but somehow she still manages to keep it together. He tells Molly to go and brush her teeth and starts clearing the table, but Mom stops him. I'll do that later. You've got a bus to catch. The thought comes to him again, as it has so many times over the past few weeks. He should just tell her. He will feel so much better once he gets it off his chest. But how? How is he supposed to tell her that he isn't the person she thinks he is?